With the Olympic Games underway in Beijing, Elizabeth Palmer has a look at how the Chinese Communist Party has tightened control and expanded surveillance, all under the guise of public health.
After apparently straying to the edge of the approved zone, the IOC says it was an isolated incident, but it does show that rules in Beijing are strict. They kicked in as soon as athletes and officials landed. They were COVID tested and then sealed into what's meant to be an infection-free bubble with special buses to take them around. Athletes are tested twice a day, also had to download a monitoring app. The Chinese government has stuck to its zero COVID policy, placing millions of people under strict lockdowns even in modest outbreaks. It reports a death toll of just over 4,500 people. But in a country of 1.4 billion, Western health analysts believe that number is just too low. Chinese officials say their success in large measure rests on this tracking app, an electronic big brother that sits on everyone's phone and tracks COVID cases and exposure. It's literally the key to entering buildings, taking cabs, or traveling. Typical of the people we asked, this couple said they're fine with that. Maybe so, but on top of the vast network of facial recognition cameras, it's given Chinese authorities a new super surveillance tool to monitor and meddle in more than 1 billion lives. Given the power and the reach of a prickly Chinese state, U.S. officials have counseled American athletes not to criticize China while they're at the Games and to stay safe. Margaret?
Liz Palmer, thank you. We'll be right back. We turn now to former FDA Commissioner and Pfizer board member, Dr. Scott Gottlieb. Good morning to you, Doctor.
Good morning.
900,000 Americans have died over the last 2 years from COVID. That's the population of Indianapolis, greater than the population of San Francisco, Charlotte, North Carolina. Where are we now as a country in this fight?
Well, look, we're still tragically in this fight. I think when you look across the country right now, you see the cases declining very quickly all across the country. In almost every state, if you look week over week, cases have declined sharply. So we're a good part of the way through this Omicron wave. If you look at places like New York, New Jersey, Maryland, cases are down to about 20 to 30 cases per 100,000 people per day, which is a low level. That's about where we were before the Delta surge. Other parts of the country are still at about 100 cases per 100,000 people per day, 140. You look at states like North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky right now, Oklahoma, they're about at that level. So some parts of the country still are in the thick of their Omicron wave, coming down, but still in the thick of it. Other parts like New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Boston, if you look at some of the leading indicators, have come way down, and I think that they're through the worst of this particular wave of infection.
And we're hearing from governors. There was a bipartisan group of them that met with President Biden just in the past few days, saying they want guidelines to talk about moving from pandemic to an endemic stage here. And yet we're at 2,400 deaths a day. That doesn't feel like we're close to the end.
No, it doesn't feel like that. And we're not close to the end right now, depending on how you measure that. I think that this is going to be a long struggle. This is a virus that's going to be persistent. We're going to have to continue to take measures to protect vulnerable people. I think what governors are agitating for is some clear guideposts that define what the on and off ramp is for this. When do we start to roll back this mitigation? And we don't have a agreed upon set of nomenclature and metrics for measuring that. If you look at CDC right now, many state authorities and public health authorities talk about 10 cases per 100,000 people per day being a metric that rates you being in sort of a low level of spread. If you look at CDC's guidance, they talk about 10 cases per 100,000 people per week. So that's 1.44 cases a day. That's a level of spread, a sufficiently low level of spread that we've never been at any point in this pandemic. And that's where CDC defines a low level of spread that would justify removing masks, for example, in schools. And so I think what governors are sensing is that we need to agree upon a set of metrics when we're going to start to roll back these mitigation steps and give people a light at the end of the tunnel. What is that point when this stuff gets turned off?
Well, you talk about clear steps and masks. The governor of Virginia, we talked about on this program, lifted the mask mandates for schools, and he on January 23rd, when I asked you what should be done here, you said that was too early, but in 2 weeks we'd be in a place where mask mandates could be lifted. So that puts us right where we are right now. Can mask mandates be lifted in most schools?
Look, I think you're going to see governors start to do that. I think we're 2 weeks out. We've seen prevalence come down. Connecticut, their mask mandate expires on February 15th. I would expect that that's not going to be renewed, and schools in the state of Connecticut will very quickly lift mask requirements for students. I think you're going to see the same thing in New York, New Jersey, other states where Omicron has come down, where vaccination rates are especially high. I think you're going to see states do that. And we're at a point where we can safely contemplate that. That doesn't mean that this isn't going to continue to spread, but when prevalence is low, you have a lot of people who've been infected who have some level of immunity for a period of time, and you have high vaccination rates, we can start to lean forward and take a little bit more risk and try to at least make sure that students in schools have some semblance of normalcy for this spring term. A lot of kids haven't really known a normal school day for 2 years now, so we need to try to lean forward aggressively to try to restore that and reclaim it when we can.
Mm-hmm. But then I'm a parent of a young child who doesn't have access to a vaccine yet. I don't want to take a mask off of his face. When will he be vaccinated? I mean, the FDA said they want to reconsider their earlier guidance, and now they are looking at 2 doses. First week of March, do I go into a pediatrician's office and get a shot?
It's possible. Look, the decision is ultimately going to reside with FDA. The briefing documents on the data that the FDA is going to review are going to be out this Friday. The agency is going to have an advisory committee, a public advisory committee on February 15th. After that, I would expect that they'll make a decision on the vaccine for children ages 6 months to 4 years old. And they have a lot more data to evaluate. I think when people see that data come out, some of it will be out Friday in the briefing documents, all of it will be out in the public advisory committee meeting. I think that they'll see that the data package has evolved from when they first looked at it back in December. And what's happened over that intervening time is Omicron. 11.4 million children have been infected through this pandemic. 3.5 million of them were infected in just the month of January, and that was Omicron. And there were 1.6 million kids under the age of 5 infected over the course of the pandemic. So we now have a lot of experience of the kids in that trial who were vaccinated, who made it through the Omicron wave, and we'll be able to evaluate how protective that vaccine was.
I know you used to run the FDA, but do you think the FDA made a mistake by not authorizing this back in December when they had the first chance to do so?
Look, I always felt that it was important to get baseline immunity in those children. Remember, Pfizer, the company I'm on the board of, made a decision to test low doses in children ages 6 months to 5 years old because they wanted to find the lowest dose possible that provided some immune response but improved tolerability. By choosing a very low dose in the children, it's a 3 microgram dose compared to a 30 microgram dose in adults, you improve the tolerability of the vaccine. But the sacrifice was that the absolute efficacy of the vaccine wasn't as substantial as what you saw in 16 to 25. And that's the data they were looking at back in December. They saw that the immune response wasn't as substantial, so they wanted to wait and see how those kids did. I still believe it was important to get baseline immunity in children ahead of the Omicron wave. They chose not to do that. I think they now have an opportunity to look at a much richer data set because they have the collective experience of all the kids who were enrolled in this trial who made it through Omicron. Some got infected. Hopefully some didn't. I think that's what the data package is going to show. And I think it's going to give a much clearer picture of what the effectiveness of this vaccine is in Omicron.
And then the open question is how many parents choose to take advantage of that vaccine being accessible. Dr. Gottlieb, it's always good to talk to you, and we'll catch up with you next Sunday. We'll be back in a moment. Last week, we spoke with a group of parents to get their perspective on parenting during the pandemic and the prospect of soon being able to get very young children vaccinated.
Few of the daycare moms and I have made a joke about like waiting in line for like a concert. Basically, who's bringing the tent?
Well, I mean, my son has had COVID. He's been through it, and it was pretty rough. I know what I felt like when I got the vaccine. For a 3-year-old to communicate what they really are feeling, and if there's a problem, can they actually do that? I don't think they can. That's part of the reason why we want to wait.
Cam, how about you? How have you fared and how have your children fared during this pandemic?
So my son's 13, so he started at a new school right when it started. I still think he's sort of playing catch up and trying to get back to some level of normalcy.
But did the vaccine make a tremendous difference in his life or in your psychology?
Absolutely, because you always want to do anything you possibly can to protect your child. And unfortunately, I lost my best friend who opted to not get vaccinated prior to my son being able to get vaccinated. So as soon as it was an option for him to be able to get the vaccine, he was 12 when he got it, there wasn't any hesitation on my part.
Alejandro, your children are a little bit older. What was your conversation about the need to get vaccinated or not?
My kids are my kids are really prudent, verging on the hypochondriac. So they got vaccinated as soon as they were eligible. I didn't have to push them at all. If anything, they pushed me.
And I mean, how did that make you feel as a parent?
It made me feel safer. We were not, given their ages, I wasn't worried about them dying of COVID, but I was worried about them having the flu from hell and then having any long-term consequences of that flu from hell.
Do all of you and do all of your children wear masks? Raise your hand. And they all wear masks when they go to school. Are any of you, do any of you hope that they get to take off that mask soon, or is it just normal now?
My middle child is going to college, and at colleges, they really have a nasty mental health crisis. It's not made up, and the COVID restrictions have a lot to do with that. It's masking, the social distancing, the asking for the having to get tested twice a week, and so on and so forth. It's really taxing, and it's really affecting their social lives. It's driving some of them pretty crazy, I guess.
Allison, I want you to jump in here because I think you've got a pretty interesting point of view. You are actually a pediatrician. Are you concerned about development with young children, given all the restrictions we're living under? Do you think that's a valid worry from parents?
I do, especially for our teenage children. As far as the little ones go, I am not quite so concerned because these little ones are so resilient. So I think it's less of a concern than the big kids. But yeah, I think it's definitely an issue. I see it in my own daughter she's in first grade, and in kindergarten, she was wearing a mask all year and it wasn't an issue. And at the beginning of this year, they didn't have them wearing masks. And she was thrilled, of course. And then with the upsurge and the new variant, they had them return to masks. And she just cried. She was devastated. So it really brought it kind of in more perspective to me that, I mean, this is hard for them. It affects them so much more than we realize sometimes.
When you hear the term children are resilient, do you think that's a positive way of characterizing things, or does it anger you a little bit?
It's not that I don't think children are resilient. I just think sometimes there's such a focus on them being resilient and having grit that they don't get a chance to actually feel their emotions because they're too busy shoving them down to show grit and resilience. The very young, they don't have a lot of memories, but they do have, there are subconscious things that stick with them. They're going to need to feel their feelings, and we're going to need to give them the grace to do so.
That's a really, I think, important observation. Cam, what's your feeling on this?
We have a generation of youth, that are missing opportunities and experiences that they're never going to be able to have again.
Show of hands, who thinks that we can kind of make up for lost time? No one. Who thinks we can repair whatever impact there has been to our children? Caleb, you're hopeful here.
Yeah, I am, because with my with my 3-year-old, this is a new thing that none of us have ever had to go through, but I think this is just normative for them moving forward, so they won't know that it's not like the same as what we had.
Sydney, I know your children have experienced things with kind of a stop-start. How has that impacted them?
They were 12 and 14. That's a really crucial time. So for my daughter, who is a little bit more quiet anyway, we had to make sure she came out of her room. And we could kind of see her closing down, tensing up. And, so we could go into how can we help her mode. My son is a little bit more happy-go-lucky, and so he seemed to be taking everything in stride until it was clear he wasn't. Like, he was a 12-year-old who had like a 3-year-old meltdown one day. He just ran out of the house yelling, and it was we were worried.
And Cam, I know you had some difficulty seeing what the impact was of isolation on your son.
A couple months into it, he was just breaking down occasionally, and he finally wrote me a letter and said that he was concerned about when I wasn't going to be around, which was shocking. And because you see all this like death and gloom all around you. It's been much better now that he's back at school, but that first 6 to 9 months, it definitely affected him emotionally.
That must have been really hard to hear as a parent.
Oh, absolutely.
Do all of you feel like your emotional health has been impacted by COVID? Show of hands. All of you do. Do you think that impacts your ability to parent?
The CDC kept saying that's how you protect your child, is you make sure everybody around them is vaxxed and boosted, because neither of my kids' grandmothers will get vaccinated. So they haven't seen her since she was a year old. It was a hard conversation to have with my own mother, I must say. And then there came Omicron, and it didn't seem to matter that we were vaccinated and boosted. It was coming for you anyway. And so now that's part of the paranoia almost right now. Yes, I'm going to get Marcy vaccinated as soon as possible, but now I don't think of the vaccine as the way out anymore.
A painful conversation, but we hope to have a conversation with HR McMaster, who's finally up on the line in a moment, so stick with us. We'll be right back. We go now to former National Security Advisor, retired General H.R. McMaster, who is with us from Palo Alto, California. Good morning to you, and I understand you can hear me now, so that's good. I want to.
Good morning, Margaret. It's great to be with you. Thanks for your perseverance.
Yeah, well, let's pick up on that question I put to you. Do you agree with the former Vice President Mike Pence that Donald Trump was wrong in what he claims about the 2020 election?
Absolutely, and all Americans should agree with Vice President Pence. And it's time, Margaret, I think, to demand more from our political leaders, demand that they stop compromising confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes to score partisan political points. And as you know, this happens across both political parties, and it's just time to stop.
And do you believe January 6th was in any way legitimate political discourse?
No, it was illegitimate political discourse because it was an assault on the first branch of government. And so I think it's really important for us to come together now, Margaret. And, I really think it is possible to improve the transparency and the security of our elections while ensuring that every eligible voter gets to vote. So I think what we need to do is stop posturing across these political parties and begin conversations with what we can agree on. I mean, your show has been great. I got to listen to the whole thing to be here at the end. But it's pretty clear that we are emerging from a number of traumas of the past couple of years. And it's time for Americans to come together and to restore our confidence in who we are as a people and in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. And of course, Russia preys on our weaknesses and divisions and tries to portray democracy as weak. But, Margaret, I believe that totalitarianism is fragile and weak, and democracies are resilient. And we can work together and come out of these traumas stronger.
Thank you for your clarity on those questions. General, the Trump administration back in 2018 was the first to give lethal aid to Ukraine, those anti-tank systems. It didn't deter Vladimir Putin from what appears to be a plan to invade. Why not?
Well, who knows what it deterred, Margaret? It's hard to prove a negative. Of course, Russia will push, Putin will push until he meets strong resistance. And so what we really need and what you're starting to see, I think, is deterrence by denial. convincing Putin that he can no longer accomplish his objectives through the use of force. And so if his objective is to divide NATO, what he needs to see is a NATO who comes together with a stronger and higher degree of unity. If he wants to weaken Ukraine and keep it under its thumb, he's going to see obviously a rise of nationalist sentiment in Ukraine. And Ukraine is doing everything they can to strengthen themselves, not only militarily, but also economically. And what I'd like to do is see the whole world amplify the Ukrainians' voices and actually support them militarily, but also economically as well. And, you know, Margaret, I think what you see this past week, some anxiety on the part of Ukrainian leaders, because as Russia continues to prepare for what looks like a renewed massive offensive against Ukraine. It's important to remember they already invaded Ukraine. Right. 7,000 Ukrainians have already died as a result. So I think we need to help Ukraine economically as well as threaten Russia with economic consequences. What can we do to help strengthen Ukraine in the face of this crisis?
Well, what do you think is the impact then of this growing alliance between Russia and China? And, you know, is China going to be emboldened by what happens next in Europe?
I think possibly, depending on how we respond. And of course, China already is more and more aggressive in terms of extending and tightening its exclusive grip on power internally. You've seen how they've gone across sectors of their economy, continuing the genocidal campaign in Xinjiang, extinguishing human freedom in Hong Kong, persecuting journalists and anybody who might criticize the Chinese government during the Olympics, have been intimidated or imprisoned. And then, of course, externally as well, Margaret, and we've seen them bludgeon Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier, you know, weaponizing these islands on the South China Sea. Now they're painting some of their naval ships Coast Guard colors so they can claim really the biggest land grab in history in the South China Sea. And then, of course, Taiwan is probably the most dangerous flashpoint, and we've seen how aggressive they've been there as well. So it's really important, I think, for the free world to come together to strengthen, again, our confidence and to communicate to these totalitarian regimes that they can't accomplish their objectives at our expense.
H.R. McMaster, I have much more to talk to you about on China. I'm going to have to leave it right there for this moment, though. That's going to be for us today at Face the Nation. Thank you for sticking with us through some bumps. We'll see you next week.